Well, let's turn our focus here now. As South Africa celebrates Women's Month, we continue to shine the spotlight on achievements, inequalities and injustices faced by women in the country. The scourge of gender-based violence is one of that cripples families and leaves women feeling vulnerable in spaces they occupy. Over the years, various stakeholders have urged government to create an enabling environment to curb GBV and femicide. They've also called on the private sector to play its part. President Cyril Ramaphosa signed into law 3 pieces of legislation as part of strengthening the fight against GBV in the country. Now, to take this discussion further, we're now joined by Sazini Mojapelo, CEO of the Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Response Fund. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Let's talk now just about your role. Where, according to you, are we losing the mark in the fight against GBVF as well?
Good afternoon and afternoon to the listeners. I'm from the Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Response Fund that was launched in 2021 as a private sector response to deal with gender-based violence in the country. If I look at where we are at that point when we launched it, it was during COVID, and there was an increased number of cases that were reported around gender-based violence. And I think more important was the fact that people were working from home. And as a result, most women found themselves stuck with their perpetrators at home. So the incidence of gender-based violence escalated. As a private sector, there was need for a concerted effort to look at how to deal with it, and not only within the confines of the company, but within the workplace and the world of work broadly.
And where do you see, the private sector playing its part and contributing, particularly at corporate level, where some of this GBV is, playing a huge part? And did you identify a huge gap between their role as well as government's role?
Yes, there definitely is. And if I can paint a picture, private sector currently employs over 15 million people in this country. So if we look at people who are currently employed, and the response from private sector around gender-based violence is definitely lacking. The legislation has been put in place with the Convention 190 from ILO. South Africa ratified it in 2021 and put it into law into 2022. If I can say what that is, it's actually looking at sexual harassment and violence within the workplace more broadly beyond just the confines of a company. But what we find today is that most companies have not caught up with that legislation. So they are still looking at sexual harassment within the confines of the workplace and not taking into account that even if it's virtual or remote working, it's important that they cover the support and support employees within that space as well. So whilst the policy and legislative framework has been put in place, there's still significant challenges in its implementation. So as the fund, what we are calling on private sector to do is to move just beyond the policy frameworks and start getting into action. And the actionable steps are looking at how they drive prevention programs, looking at protection and enforcement.
Just in terms of your role and working with these corporates, what improvement have you seen, over the years since you started your organization in 2021? In as far as the stats are concerned, we know that GBV also increased during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. Mm-hmm. And in fact, people were referencing GBV to a second pandemic. So what changes have you seen and the impact that you've made, particularly when you talk about harassment, sexual harassment in the workplace? We know that goes on unabated.
I think what we have seen in our engagement with most corporate and private sector companies is that there's lack of knowledge and understanding around what the law stipulates, but also in practice. There's very little that is happening within the workspace or within the world of work when it comes to gender-based violence. It is still within the confines of looking at it in the context of sexual harassment, a grievance process, disciplinary hearings. When we actually say in South Africa, the extent of gender-based violence is actually a second epidemic, and there's more consistent response that is required and more action that is required. So looking at prevention strategies is where we need to start, and then looking at protection. But where we are right now, there's a lot of enforcement, and it's your traditional approaches, and we're pushing private sector to say you need to move beyond that. But in my engagements with some of the companies that we have hosted and had engagements with, they are still at an infancy stage in their understanding and implementation. As such, we are now looking at putting in place a program that will enable them to not only update their policy frameworks, but start prevention programs that look at how they can support and drive diversity and inclusion and equity within the workplace as well.
I mean, you spoke earlier on about, your attempts to move policies to action, which I find very interesting and important. How far then is the acceptance of this private sector coalition that you are then trying to establish to meet this very action?
I would say that there's broad acceptance. I have not had one engagement where there was resistance from a private sector company. The approach I've seen and received has been, okay, we were not aware. And the next step would be, how do we get to do better? And what are the policies or the frameworks that we need to put into place? And also, what kind of programs and information do we need to be able to enact and run with this kind of initiative? So I must say that I've received a very positive response. And the fund itself in its existence is because predominantly our funding comes from private sector. But we are saying beyond the societal response within companies, there actually is required to have more changes.
As we wrap up our interview, have you had people that have been affected by GBF come to you directly? Do you also accept whistleblowers in your space? Predominantly because you are funded by private entities. Is there a space for them to come to you and report any incidents in their workplace?
Absolutely. What I found with our whistleblowing line is that we're getting it predominantly from private sector companies, employees who are saying they're either experiencing a lot of bullying, virtual bullying and exclusion, and being discriminated against. So we do get a lot of that. And we would encourage people to get onto our website and get our details and report any such cases. We obviously will take it forward and see how we can assist.
And just in terms of, accountability, how far would your organization go to make sure that anybody who is found to be transgressing in the workplace is then held accountable and is arrested?
I think one of the bigger challenges we have as a nation is obviously the criminal justice system. So when you now move into a space of enforcement, we've got the policy framework within the organization that would allow for a disciplinary hearing, a grievance process, etc. to take place. Thereafter, it kicks in the labor law, which would take it to CCMA. At that point, once it gets into CCMA or it gets into the criminal justice system, it's beyond our jurisdiction and mandate. And what we can do is advocacy, and we work with some community-based organizations and NGOs like the Legal Resource Center, we would then refer people to. We also have a number of organizations across the country to date. We have supported over 166 community-based organizations in all 9 provinces. They range from providing services such as helping with protection orders, what it means to open a criminal case, shelters. And one of our key strategic initiatives is with the National Prosecuting Authority and Minerals Council, where we're looking at driving and increasing the number of Tutuzela care centers in and around. Just one initiative that gives example of the extent we will go through to try and support people within the world of work and society in general.
Thank you so much, Sazini, for your time. We really do appreciate it. Sazini Mojapelo, CEO of Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Response Fund.